Alrighty, guys, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Last week, we were speaking about renunciation, at least in part. We started speaking about renunciation, and the focus last week was more on sort of the more daily things that we can renounce, like sleep and food and this sort of thing. And so today I want to get into some of the more detailed things, the deeper things that we're supposed to be renouncing. And so today is going to be very dogmatically and doctrinally based. And so as a result, I have tried to cut down the amount of material that I'm going to present today to allow for time for you guys to actually ask questions as we're going through this, because I'm not sure how aware you are or generally exposed to this. Most people are. And so if there are questions or if there's something that I'm saying that's confusing or something like that, feel free to speak up. Okay? All good? All right. At any point, don't just wait till the end. And so this more fundamental idea, we all know that we have things that we're struggling against, things that we're supposed to be renouncing, this sort of thing. Why do we have to do this to begin with? Why is God not just setting this up for us to be sort of an easy road right from the start? Why is He putting us into this position where we actually have to struggle? To answer something like this, we have to go back to the very beginning. We have to see what we were originally intended for and what God had set us up with to begin with, so that we can see how mankind in general has progressed and why we find ourselves in the situation that we're in right now. And so, when man was created, he was created in the image and likeness of God. Who knows what this means? What does image and likeness mean? Oftentimes we think that they mean the same thing, but they don't. And so what do they actually mean? There is a distinction.
He was like us without sin though.
So that's Christ. Mm-hmm. Christ being in the likeness of us, right? And we'll get to that. But what does it mean for us to be created in His image and likeness?
Supposed to be an example of Him.
Okay.
Soul, spirit, light.
Okay, so these are the components that make up man, our body, soul, and spirit. And I believe that you guys had a speaker come in. I think Abuna Anthony came in and spoke to you guys about body, soul, and spirit. Yes? Does everyone remember that? I remember it. And so when we speak about the spirit, as you guys know, that is the part that is made in the image and likeness of God, right? And all of man is supposed to be like that as well, as a whole person. But what does that mean? What does that actually mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? So the fathers will make this distinction for us, and we'll see this as early as Saint Irenaeus. So, and probably earlier than that, but he was the first one that really elucidated it for us. So the image means that you have certain characteristics that are just like God, so that we are rational beings. Being rational is something that is given to man. This is not something that other animals or other parts of creation will have, other physical parts of creation will have. And so, rationality, free will, the immortality of the soul, these things are in the image of God. God Himself is immortal, He's outside of time, and so He gives us certain characteristics of His so that we can share in that as well. And so, the immortality of the soul, for example, is something that we get to share in by grace. This is something that He gives to us as a gift. And so He gives us the gift of free will. He gives us the gift of being rational and reasonable creatures. And so that is image. The likeness is just exactly what you would imagine a likeness to be. Likeness means how much you actually are similar to God. And so this is something that is given to us as a potential. This is not something that's guaranteed from the get-go. And so while the image is something that can't be taken away from us, no matter how bad we fall into sin or something like this, we're always going to have free will. We're always going to be rational and reasonable creatures. We're always going to have the immortality of the soul. These things are not going to be taken away from us, but the likeness is really how much I look like God. How much I can actually emulate God. Okay? And so when we say that we want to be Christ-like, this is the perfection of this, how we actually end up realizing this. Okay? And so this is the likeness that we're supposed to be focusing on. And so in the very beginning, a lot of people think wrongly that Adam was just created to be perfect, and there was no struggle at that point. And while it's true that he was without sin, he wasn't perfect in the sense that we like to think about perfection, right? He still had potential to grow. And that's what he was supposed to be doing. He was supposed to be growing. So he's not only given this commandment not to eat, but he's also given a command to have dominion over everything, to be responsible for everything, this sort of thing, right? And so the idea was that he would grow more and more in his relationship with God by doing this, right? Because God, being Pantocrator, being almighty, gave him the ability to have dominion over other things so that he could be a true steward for things, so that he could raise the things that are around him in creation to God, right? And in so doing, become more and more like God, and to share in that love. And so Adam was given this potential, and he didn't live up to it. He takes the tools that were given to him, and he uses it for his own purpose. He uses it so that he could direct it towards himself, not towards God. He uses it so that he could direct it towards other people in a broken way, not towards God. Okay? Now, what do I mean by this? When we see, for example, that we struggle, so in Orthodox theology, we have 8 passions that we'll talk about. In the West, they talk about the 7 deadly sins, right? Everyone knows 7 deadly sins. They make movies about them and this sort of thing. In Orthodoxy, there's 8 passions, okay? And I'm going to list them off for you, and we're not going to be able to go into detail about all of them because that would take maybe another 2 or 3 months, and we don't have that kind of time here. But the 8 principal passions are gluttony and lust, avarice and covetousness, anger, dejection, despondency, vainglory, and pride. Okay? And so there are these 8 things that we struggle against. And if you take into consideration for yourself the things that you end up struggling with, you'll find that if it's not with one of these 8, it's what the Orthodox fathers will say is a daughter of one of these 8. There's something, everything that we end up struggling with has its foundation within these 8 passions. Okay? And so the immediate response that most people would give is, why would God give me this sort of thing to struggle with to begin with? Like, for example, if I struggle greatly with avarice, if I really seek after money, for example, why would he give me that? Why would he give me the struggle of lust? Why would I have something like that to actually deal with? Why do I have to deal with jealousy and envy against other people? Why do I have anger? Why would he just set me up like this? Because I'm sure that you guys can see that some of these things are not learned traits, right? I assume that some of you guys have kids, and if you don't, that you've been around little babies, and you can see that some of them are just inclined to anger. Some of them are just angry babies, right? And so, why are there angry babies? Is it always the responsibility of the parent? Not always, sometimes. But it's not always from that, right? Some people just have certain characteristics within them. And if you think about yourself, you'll see that within yourself. You have certain inclinations within yourself that you'll say, well, God made me like this. God made me to be a glutton, for example. I really love food. And so he designed me like this. He designed me to really like food. I mean, what am I supposed to do? And so I'm just going to go and gobble everything up because that's the way that he made me. And that's not the actual case. And so this is a big error in our thinking, because in so thinking that, we think that God created evil by doing this, right? maybe we won't effectively say it out loud like that, but we'll say, okay, well, if God made me to be a glutton, that means that he created me to be evil. Because gluttony is evil. There's no doubt. That is a passion that's evil, right? Lust, avarice, pride, vainglory, all of these things are evil. So there has to be something that we have to consolidate in our minds right now to make sure that we're not setting it up to think that God just set us up for failure or that he created us to be evil. Is everyone following along so far? Yeah? Okay. And so St. Isaiah, the solitary, he writes about this. And I'm just going to go through 3 examples that he says. Okay? He says about lust. He says, it's natural for the soul to strive for God, but the enemy changed it to shameful lust. And so that feeling that we end up having, that we liken to lust, was supposed to be used, it's a tool that was given to Adam that was supposed to be directed towards God. Not so that you can have this sort of romantic involvement with God, not in that sense, but so that you can strive after him with this zealous love. And when he takes that tool, when Adam takes that tool, and he corrupted that tool, he ended up directing it towards other people. And so we have this tool at our disposal that has been altered in what its original intent is. And we're the ones that ended up altering this. So, for jealousy and envy, he says, zealousness for God was changed in people to unnatural jealousy and envy of one another. And so what we were supposed to be intended for, we were supposed to see those things that we wanted to emulate in God. How we can actually realize that likeness, how we can realize that potential. And so we wanted to seek after that. And rather than doing that, we became jealous of one another. We see other traits that other people have, and we become jealous of that. We become jealous of their possessions. We become jealous of how well they're liked, or whatever. These sorts of things that were supposed to be directed towards God in a good way were transformed. Anger, he says, the ability to be angry at the devil, without which it would be impossible to reject his temptations, was turned into wrath towards one's neighbor because of everything that is not needful and useless. And so those things that we actually get upset about with other people, if you're married and you get really upset with your spouse, or with your kid, or with your friends, or with your boss, or any of these things, this sort of anger was not intended to be directed towards other humans for the reasons that we usually direct them towards, right? He says clearly that the reason that this inclination was given to us was so that we can resist temptation by being angry with the devil. And so God provides man with a toolbox. And he says, you are free to use these tools as you like. The original intent is to be used for good. And Adam ends up using this for something else. Using this for his own self-serving purposes. And these self-serving purposes end up leading to a very self-centered person. And so now we're very self-centered. And this is what I was making reference to last week when we were talking about these self-centered pleasures that we seek after. These pleasures, if we were to use these things for their intended purpose, we would have a godly pleasure that we would take in so doing. But we've made them self-centered pleasures, so that now gluttony is an amazing thing for us, right? We just love to do that. We love a great filet mignon, for example, right? Or lust. And you could just see how many people in this world, particularly in our culture, are afflicted with this particular passion. So many people fall into it. Dare I say, maybe all of us fall into this particular passion of lust, right? And it's not its original intent. It's because we have directed those tools that were supposed to be directed towards God, toward ourselves, okay? And so, St. Gregory of Nyssa, he says, if when the light shines very brightly, someone chooses to hide his eyes by lowering his eyelids, the sun is not responsible for the fact that he cannot see it. And so, if I'm standing outside and I close my eyes and I can't see the sun and I can't see anything that it's lighting up, it's not the fault of the sun. It's not God's fault that I have turned my eyes away from Him. He is still there. He is still shining. His goodness is still presented to me. But I turn my eyes away from Him. So the real cause of this is mankind. Now, granted, like I said before, some people are born with certain inclinations within them, right? So that we, like I was saying before, we have angry babies sometimes, right? And so it's true that you yourself in particular may not be responsible for having obtained that particular passion that you have to struggle against. However, you are responsible for fighting against it. So when Adam fell, all of mankind falls, right? So all of mankind ends up receiving something called the flesh, right? And in Orthodox theology, the flesh is something that is the thing that we end up struggling against, okay? Now the flesh is not the body. The body is not what's received as an evil thing. The body's a good thing, right? When Abuna Anthony went over with you guys the 3 components that man is made up of body, soul, and spirit, God made body and soul and spirit. And as we said before, He doesn't make anything evil. So the body itself is not an evil thing. The soul innately is not an evil thing. And the spirit is not an evil thing. And yet the flesh is what we will see in the Bible and in the writings of the fathers as well, as being that thing that they like to characterize it as that thing that we end up struggling against. So if you guys go and read Romans 7 and Romans 8, and St. Paul is speaking about the spirit struggling with the flesh, he's not saying that the spirit is struggling with the body. He's saying that the spirit is struggling with all of those passions, those things that are against God's will. They're long chapters, but they're very good. And so I encourage you guys to actually go home and read them, because they're very useful. Okay? And so when we think about what we're supposed to be renouncing, if you think to yourself that these things are evil things, then shouldn't its renunciation be a good thing? Like, shouldn't that be something that brings me pleasure or happiness or joy or something like this? Why does it always end up feeling so miserable, struggling against these things? Like, for example, if we really like food and we have to abstain from food because we really like food, that feels terrible, right? It's not something that's very comfortable for us to go through. And so why is it that when I'm doing something good and I'm actually directing the tools back towards God, why is it so difficult? Why does it feel so terrible? And so the fathers give this fantastic metaphor. And they speak about God being a surgeon. And they say that we are diseased. Because you have to keep in mind in Orthodox theology that sin is not a legalistic thing. We don't talk about legalism here, right? Sin is a disease. And we're in great need of a cure. And so they speak about God as a physician, as a surgeon, who's going to go and who's going to do surgery on you. And that is not something that feels very good, right? If you go to a surgeon now, say God forbid one of us has cancer, for example, okay? And a tumor starts developing. You go and you voluntarily put yourself into a hospital under the care of a surgeon who says, I'm going to cut you open and you're going to bleed, and I'm going to take this out, and then you're going to be in pain afterwards, right? This is going to be painful. I'm going to put you on pain medication and this sort of thing, and you have to have a hospital stay. And so the surgeon's job is that, and we're very thankful for him doing that, because we understand that no matter how great that thing is that he's going to take away from us, he's doing it so that he can actually preserve our life for a little bit longer, right? And so in some situations, it's a little thing, right? Something that grows on your skin. And in some situations, it's so big that the surgeon has to take off a limb, for example, right? And we see this. People lose limbs all the time. And yet they're so thankful to the surgeon for doing this. And yet when we see how we end up relating to God, we'll yell at him for doing this kind of thing. Well, why are you doing surgery on me? And he says, look, you have cancer. I'm trying to take that out from you. You have a passion that is being misdirected in its tool. It's supposed to be directed towards good things. And not just because he's sort of self-seeking, because he's not. God is not self-seeking, and he just wants everything to his glory. He wants it for your glory. He wants to heal you. You are the patient. You're the one that he's out to heal. And so he gives us this surgery so that he can actually uproot the passions. And so when we start struggling, we'll feel this. We'll feel that this is uncomfortable for us. And while there's a certain grace that comes along with it as well, and there are times when we might feel as though we're making great progress and that the surgery is going well, and now I don't feel the cancer as I did before, for example, oftentimes it will still continue to hurt. Okay? And so we just have to keep in mind that this is not a legalistic thing. It's not like you commit a sin and then God is going to come and take this coin away that represents sin from your little basket and say, okay, well, now you're clean. That's not what this is. This is actual disease that's in us that has to come out. Okay? And so, if we're looking at all of this, and we're seeing that we have to struggle against all of this stuff, one of the natural questions that people end up coming up with is, well, why did he make it like that to begin with? Why even give us the tools that could be directed one way or another? Why not just make us perfect from the beginning? Like, not even to realize the potential, but having realized the potential, why doesn't he just start us off like that? Because wouldn't it be so great for us to just experience this sort of love and happiness and joy right from the beginning? Why test us? And so I'm going to read this quote from St. Basil the Great, and it's a bit of a lengthy quote, but it's beautiful, and it's the most succinct way that I imagine that this could actually be put. So bear with me, and I'm going to pause in certain places so that you guys can actually hear what's being said. He says, "But why did we not have sinlessness in our structure, one may ask, so that the will to sin would not exist in us? Because indeed, it is not when your household slaves are in bonds that you consider them well disposed, but when you see them willingly fulfill your wishes." So if he's going to make you like a slave, and he's just going to, that was the sort of the best metaphor that they could come up with at the time, of someone working against their will. In our time, you can imagine like if you're made like a robot, right? If you're just kind of programmed like a computer. There's no love in that. If you constrain someone to do something, if you just form them in a certain way. So again, indeed it is not when your household slaves are in bonds that you consider them well disposed, but when you see them willingly fulfill your wishes. Accordingly, God does not love what is constrained, but what is accomplished out of virtue. And virtue comes into being out of free choice and not of constraint. And what is up to us is self-determined. Accordingly, the one who finds fault with the Creator for not fashioning us by nature sinless is no different from one who prefers the non-rational nature to the rational, and what lacks motion and impulse to what has free choice and activity. So he's saying these things that we try to find fault in God for, and we say, why would you make me like this? Why would you even give me this struggle to begin with? He says, that's like saying that you would choose to be like an animal rather than being a human being that's called to be glorious. You just want to choose to be an animal that really doesn't have any sort of free will, no rationality to him. Rationality in the sense of what God intends for us. You just want to be a robot. Who would do that? And he says, if you do that, if you're just like that, God doesn't want that. God wants you to rise to that love out of virtue, out of struggle. Not because he wants you to struggle, but because this is how we actually display love to one another. Right? If anyone here is married, you'll know that if you're simply in the marriage and you're just sort of going along and you say, well, I guess this person has to love me because I do X, Y, and Z for them. That's not real love, right? Love has to be a sacrifice, and love has to be a choice, right? It's a choice, and it's freely given. If indeed these points are a digression, so he's saying if this is just some sort of I mean, he was discussing this earlier in his tract, and you guys should read this if you can. It's in a book called On the Human Condition, and it's published by St. Vladimir's. And it's the title of this sermon that he gave is on why God is not the author of evil. So he says, if indeed these points are a digression, it was necessary to say them, lest falling into an abyss of arguments, lest falling into an abyss of arguments, you remain deprived of the things you most desire and also deprived of God. Therefore, let us stop correcting the wise one. Let's stop correcting God. Let us stop seeking what is better than the things that come from Him. For if indeed the detailed principles which He has planned escape us, let this belief be present in your souls, namely that nothing evil comes into being from the good one. So He is not the creator of evil. We brought this on ourselves. What He did was He gave us free choice so that we can actually offer out of free choice, out of our own struggle, love to Him. Does that make sense? Everyone following along? Okay. And so now, when we see what we were talking about, at least in part last week, when we were talking about the benefit of reading books from the fathers or listening to sermons from priests or this sort of thing, or even coming to Monday night and listening to speakers here, the real benefit, like what we were talking about last week, was in doing them. But the reason why we rely on them so much is because this is the experience of people that have gone through this. They're human beings just like us, right? Like when I speak about St. Isaiah the Solitary, or if I speak about St. Basil the Great, or if I speak about St. Gregory of Nyssa, or any of these people, all of these people were human beings just like you and me. They were not in some sort of a position where they sat back and they said, well, you know, I'm a saint, and so now I'm going to write about all this stuff because I'm a saint and I'm different from all of you guys in your face. That's not what they're doing, right? That's not what's actually being presented. They're human beings just like us, and they struggle with the same things that we struggled with. And so when we see the books that they wrote, and they speak about these things, they speak out of their experience. And that's why this is so beneficial for us. And those are in books that are directly related to this sort of thing, right? And so last week we were speaking about the Ladder of Divine Ascent, or you can read a number of other books that are directed towards this sort of personal development, becoming more and more like God, right? But not all the books are like that. Some of the books are about dogma and doctrine, and we might think to ourselves, well, this has nothing to do with me, I don't like this kind of stuff, it's so boring, it's very complicated, I don't care what Athanasius or Cyril said, and this sort of thing. And it's boring because we don't know how to relate to it. These books are very useful for us if we actually know how to relate to it. And so I'm going to give you guys an example on this particular point that we were talking about. What is the great thing about the Incarnation? Why are we so happy about the Incarnation? We just celebrated this a few weeks ago, right? And I'm sure some people were reading On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius up to that point. And many of us have forgotten that we even celebrated the feast a few weeks ago. Okay? Why is the Incarnation so important? Anybody? Someone give me something. Why is His birth so important for us?
To remind us what the likeness of God is.
Okay, that is true.
So Christ is Emmanuel, He's God with us. So He took the divine and He unified it with the nature of man. So there was the divine and the nature into one person. And through that he what's the quote from St. Gregory at the end? What he has not assumed, he has not saved. So he, by taking on our nature, He sanctifies it. He brings the divinity into it, and He brings the likeness. So He's like the perfect human. He shows us, or he brings the perfect human, which is reached that ultimate level of perfection.
That is very
and
true.
now gives us the ability to, in communion with Him, also grow in that life.
Absolutely true. What else?
Salvation?
Well, salvation does not just start at the Incarnation, but it starts even before that. And so when you guys see in our Tazbeha, for example, that they speak about the economy of salvation, that is a whole story of Christ from the beginning, before any of this happens, before many of the prophecies come about him, even in Genesis there's a prophecy about him coming and saving us, right? And so all of that is within the economy of salvation. And so that is a very important point. The greatness about the incarnation, and this is what you will see in Romans 8, is that he takes on sinful flesh. Now that doesn't mean that he has sin, but he takes on this flesh that we were talking about before, right? In Greek, it's sarx. And so when we say avechi sarx in the liturgy, what we're saying is that he was incarnate, right? Literally, he took flesh, right? Like incarnate, the Latin word for it is the same Latin words that we use when we describe the meat that we go and we see in the supermarket, carne asada, right? Carne means flesh, right? And so he took on flesh. He didn't just take on a body, he took on flesh. He took on this fallen nature. So he didn't just come in its absolute perfection and come exactly like how Adam was. He came and he was tired, so he had to sleep. He came and he was thirsty and he had to drink. And he was hungry and this sort of thing. Did he have to struggle with these particular passions? No. But that's because this is still a potential within the sinful nature, within the flesh, but he takes this and he sanctifies it so that we can actually use this for the good that's intended. So that he actually shows us, like what you guys were referring to, what the potential was supposed to be. The fullness of that, right? So that when he gets angry, he's angry in the way that we're supposed to be angry, right? So that when he looks at St. Peter, and Peter tells him, no, you shouldn't go and get crucified and this sort of thing, he says, get thee behind me, Satan, right? Because the anger is supposed to be directed towards Satan, right? In terms of resisting him and resisting his temptation. And so all of this is, like, the whole thing is so phenomenal because the incarnation is not just the King of Kings coming and the trumpets blaring and this sort of, though that did happen. The greatness of it is that in my fallen nature, because all of these feasts have to have some sort of relationship with me for them to be meaningful, he takes on this fallen nature so that he can raise it up with him. That's amazing. That's something that we should be very, very thankful for. But we should also see, in being so thankful, the kind of humility that had to be endured by him to do something like this. And he does this freely out of his love for us, right? True humility. Not just to become a man, but to take on this sinful flesh. Okay? And again, just to clarify, he's without sin, and we all know that, right? But the flesh itself is something that has been fallen. And it is even subject to death, and we know very well, because it is what we're so proud of, that he went and he died in that flesh, and he raised that flesh. Which is to say, he raised my flesh, and he ascended with my flesh, and now he sits at the right hand of the Father with my flesh. That's how much honor and dignity and respect and love he has for mankind. That's amazing, right? No matter how big you think God is and how great, imagine that greatness and man sitting on his right hand. And he's done this fully out of his love. So all of those things that we're supposed to be struggling against, he now has given us the tool again. He's sort of recharged our ability to be able to overcome all of this. So that if I am born as an angry person, I don't have to stay an angry person. I'm not responsible for being born angry, but I'm certainly responsible for how I end up developing that if I actually have these sorts of actions. And so this brings us back to the beginning. And St. Isaac the Syrian says this. He says, it's a greater miracle that a man can see his true self than the raising of the dead. So we think it would be a huge miracle, and I'm sure that many, many, many people think this. If you ever have someone in your family or a friend or something like that that has passed away, and you go down to the church and you're praying in church, when they're praying the funeral prayers on them, I know I've thought this before when I was younger. I would say, God, why can't you just raise this person and show your glory right now in front of us, right? Like, how amazing of a miracle would that be if this person just like knocked on the inside and then he sat up and was like, oh my gosh, this person's back. That'd be such a huge miracle, right? I think everybody would just be totally blown away. And St. Isaac the Syrian says that a greater miracle than that is actually seeing your true self. Sitting down and examining yourself and seeing how you fare in comparison to being in the likeness of God. How you fare in struggling with these passions. And everyone has them in sort of different degrees. And so we all have to struggle a little bit differently. But we all have the tools given to us by Christ to be able to struggle against this. And to be victorious. So that it's not just something that we're just sort of hoping for and we're just, it's like throwing it in the wind and I hope that this works out. And this, be assured of this, that if you struggle, He will help. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. And so the thing that we're supposed to be renouncing ultimately is ourselves, right? Those passions that we're really struggling against, those things that on a daily basis I end up struggling with. And I'll use gluttony because we do it all the time, and I don't think anyone ever really confesses it, and maybe like 1% do. But it's probably the easiest one to speak about, right? Gluttony. If every day I'm struggling with this, I don't have to struggle with this. I have someone on the other side who's a victor on this, right? When they speak of Christ being a mediator, it's not like He's being a mediator to God the Father, who's a wrathful God, and now He's going to go and plead, please accept humanity, because that's not what mediator means, right? He is there having given us the tools to be able to go back to being God-like. And so on a very daily basis, this is what I'm supposed to be renouncing. This is what I'm supposed to be struggling with. And the church confirms this for me all the time, right? They say, look, if you can overcome gluttony, you can overcome lust and avarice and jealousy of other people and pride and vainglory. You can do this. And it just wants to, the church continuously wants to encourage us towards this so that we know exactly what it is that we're renouncing. This is what our renunciation is supposed to be. When the Desert Fathers speak about renunciation of the world, it seems obvious to us that what they're talking about is running away from all of these things and going and living in some cell in a monastery. But even they will confirm that if you run away from the world and anger lives inside of you, you have not done any such great thing towards yourself. Because anger is still inside of you. You still have to struggle against this. The world that they retreat from is not this physical stuff. It's not the cars and the glamour and Hollywood and the movies and blah. That's not what they're retreating from, although that is also what they're doing. They're retreating from these things that we are struggling against. And so that is what we're supposed to be doing. This is the renunciation that we're supposed to be going out and trying to seek after. And so, of course, just like I said last time, if you really want to do this, you should have a spiritual guide, right? Because it's great to read the books and to become so inflamed with zeal and say, you know what, I'm going to go and I'm going to do this. But you need a guide to help you along the way so that you don't overexert yourself. A guide is going to be very important, and the books are very important, and the sermons are very important, as long as you make use of them. So you can go and read the Fathers, but make use of them. You can go and read about dogma, but understand how it relates to you as a person. You specifically. Read the Bible and see how that relates to you specifically. When you read, and it says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, understand that you are the one that might be being persecuted. It's not just this sort of outside, oh yeah, those people in Egypt are blessed because they're being persecuted. I'm being persecuted as well sometimes, right? I'm supposed to be the one that this gospel is directed towards. And so I should pray for those other people, there's no doubt, because that's what we were called to do. But understand that you have to find yourself in these things. So that if you're reading about dogma, or you're reading about this personal development in Christ, or what have you, all of these things should be directed towards yourself, for your betterment. I'm going to cut it short there so that you guys can actually ask your questions. If anyone actually has questions. Otherwise, I could keep going. Questions?
You mentioned that Jesus didn't struggle with the passions, but it's my understanding that he was tempted just like any man was, but obviously didn't fall.
Right.
So he wasn't perfect in the sense where he had the ability or the preconception or I just feel like the way you word it has to be very particular, because you can't say that he was perfect in that he never tasted temptation.
To be tempted is not something that's wrong. To be tempted is not something that's up to you. That is something that's introduced to you. So if I come up to you and I tempt you right now, that's not your sin. You know what I mean? And so though he is tempted, he doesn't struggle with that temptation. He's not up on the mountain and he's hungry and he says, why don't you turn these rocks into bread? And then he stands back and thinks to himself, you know what, maybe I should. He doesn't. He doesn't think of it like that. Though the temptation is presented to him. You know what I mean? And so the fathers will speak about him and all of mankind having two kinds of general passions, right? These blamable passions, like what it was that I actually ended up discussing, right? Very superficially here. And unblameable passions, like getting tired and hungry and thirsty and this sort of thing. These are unblameable passions. These are things that were not supposed to be experienced by mankind, but still came along with the fall, right? And so work as we know it now, and we know this from reading Genesis, was not supposed to look the way that it does now, right? Because when Adam falls, then God says, now you have to go out and toil in the fields, and now the land is not going to be very forgiving for you and this sort of thing, right? And so these things are unblameable passions. No one's going to fault you for wanting to eat. No one's going to fault you for wanting to drink. And so these are things that he ends up having within his own flesh. But to say that he is tempted and has to struggle with anger or lust or any of these things, he never has to struggle with them, not even a little bit, because he's very purposed. He knows, because he's God, he knows what they are intended for, and he uses them to the full extent of that.
Okay, so keeping that as a foundation and building on that, mankind struggles with those things. Unlike God did not struggle with those things. And God being perfect and Jesus Christ being perfect, while man lacks perfection, but man does struggle towards perfection.
Right.
And so ever so slightly, man gets closer and closer towards perfection. Does that also imply that he also gets closer and closer towards the lack of struggle against those things?
Yes.
So he gets better and better at not struggling against those things.
Yes, but not because of his own virtue. It is given to him as a gift. And so that you could see, for example, in the stories of the Desert Fathers, that someone will struggle with a particular sin for 60 years and then overcome it. They'll overcome it. And they will overcome it because it's given to them as a gift, by grace, right? You've struggled for this long, and I know where your heart is. Whatever the mentality is of giving them that gift, and then they couldn't overcome that.
St. Louis the Black is a perfect example.
Like that, right? And so these are things that are possible, and the continued growth towards Christ is something that we're supposed to be doing here, and will continue in the coming age as well. So that after you die, you're still supposed to be growing. You don't just remain stagnant. Other questions?
You said that these 8 passions exist in the world because of the misuse of the tools that were provided to Adam by God.
Right.
And it's Adam's corruption of these tools that caused these 8 passions to
Right.
exist. So how do you explain the jealousy of Lucifer?
So, he also has free will. Lucifer also had free will. And rather than magnifying, because you have to take into consideration, though he wasn't tempted by anyone, he tempted himself. Anyone that has free will has a choice between God or not God. And that's what he ended up choosing, not God. Right? And so it's not like someone came and tempted him, because even the fathers will say that when we fall, sometimes we fall not from being tempted by the devil at all, just by our own fall. Just by ourselves wanting to fall, so that he doesn't even have to do any work. And so the same thing happened to Lucifer as well, in that he knew precisely what he was doing, in that he wanted to be greater than God. He wanted to have this sort of, this glory that comes along with that without God. And so that is something that he ends up self-directing. So just because there's a temptation doesn't mean that there has to be someone behind the temptation. You might be the source of that.
So does that mean that the archangels were provided with these same tools to shape free will as Adam was?
Well, free will as they know it, they had free will. And so there are some fathers that will say that that time has ended for them and their judgment has already come, and that their free will is gone. Some fathers speak towards that. Some fathers say that that's not the case and they still have this sort of free will. What's important to know is that at some point, whether now or at some point in the past, they had the free will to choose God or not. Some of the fathers, just as a tidbit here, say that one of the reasons why Lucifer ends up falling is because he's jealous of man. So that man was actually created in the image and likeness of God. And Lucifer saw that man was going to be raised to this great and high level. And he said, why would you do that to some lowly creature? Why can't I be like that? And so he was jealous of man, which is why he ends up going and tempting man. Some fathers speak towards this, not all of them. But you'll even see this sometimes in sort of Western literature as well. Like if you've seen Paradise Lost, has anyone read that? Paradise Lost by John Milton, right? Paradise Lost has this idea in it, that the devil goes plummeting towards earth so that he can try to tempt man away from being God, right? Which was man's original intent, was to be like God. Other questions about this or anything? Don't be shy. I know you're a shy one.
My question would be, why would God create Lucifer or any of us if he knew the plan? If he knew, like, you say that God knows everything, God knows what has happened, what will happen, and what has happened now, right? So why would God create us if he knew that this was going to happen? If he knew that his son would have to be crucified, and that we would, and in the end we would be saved, like, what's the whole point? Like, he already knows what's going to happen.
I'll give you an example beyond what we spoke about before, in terms of the fact that love cannot be constrained. So aside from that, okay, the world that we live in right now is a pretty sad world, right? There are some very terrible things that happen, that continue to happen, just in America, for example, that are really bad, right? Though I imagine that though these bad things that are happening around us, I imagine that you still want to get married and have kids one day. And bring your kids into this terrible world. Why would you want to do that?
Exactly. I actually thought about that too. I'm like, why would you want to?
Why would you want to do that? Let me just say I'm not trying to discourage anyone from having kids, right? Because that's not the point of this, right? But it's because out of the fullness of your love, though you know that they're going to struggle with some things, you still want them to experience the greatness that is being offered, right? You still want someone to experience the greatness of God and the greatness that this world has to offer as well, right? Not just sort of the terrible things, those things that are given to us as gifts, right? And so that doesn't prevent people from then having kids, because having kids is a great thing, even though you're going to bring them into something that's like that. Now that's sort of a broken analogy in comparison to what was with God, but the same thing, right? Out of the fullness of His love, He created us, though He knows what's going to end up happening, right? He knows that people are going to fall and are going to fall away from Him and are going to turn against Him and are going to put themselves into a really terrible position. And yet He still does that because out of His love, He knows that He's still going to bring them back. It's tough. That's a tough one. I know. It's tough to accept. But consider it for yourself. Consider it for yourself just on sort of a microcosmic level of you having kids, right? You'd still want them. Imagine in your life the great things that you've experienced, even though you've experienced several terrible things in your life, right? Everyone has experienced several terrible things. But I wouldn't look back at my life and say, regardless of what has actually happened, I would never want to have been born. This is still a great thing, right? And to know and to be in the position that we're in, to have this revelation of God as it's given to us, I wouldn't give that up. Because that in itself is a great thing, regardless of all of these other things that we have to struggle with. Other questions?
So you talked about renunciation, right? And that it's something that we're called to struggle with, but that in overcoming, it's not really us that overcomes, that it's Christ that we overcome with Christ, right? Through our ability that was given to us through our union with Him. How can we practically leverage Christ, like be Christocentric, to renounce?
So one thing I just want to clarify within the question, though you stated it correctly, just so that we can be very clear, because there's a lot of people that think otherwise. It is not just you sort of letting go and letting God, as everyone says, right? It's not like you just give up everything and your whole will and you say, God, just kind of use me as a puppet so that we can go forward, right? It is you, is what the fathers say. The Greek word for this is synergeia, right? Synergy, working along with God. And so He wants you to work alongside with Him, right? He still wants you to contribute something. It's not like you just say, okay, well, you take over and, Jesus take the wheel. That's not what this is, right? This is I'm gonna go along and struggle along with Him, and He's gonna help me out with this. Now, from the basis of how are we supposed to do this practically, for many of us, we're already doing it, and we don't really know, right? So coming to church and communing and confessing and this sort of thing is already, you're already on the road to doing this, right? But this sort of has to be perfected or dialed in particular situations. And so for one person, it may be different from another. And that's why spiritual guides are so important and so helpful, because they get to see, for your particular situation in your life as it stands right now, what you need help with right now, right? And so, for example, if someone comes to me and they're 13 years old and they're struggling with the passion of lust and they're looking for advice, the advice that I'm going to end up giving to them is very different than a 25-year-old or a 40-year-old or a 60-year-old. I mean, it's very different, right? Even though the passion is the same. And so to make sort of a blanket statement as to how we're supposed to do this wouldn't be very beneficial, right? But to be Christocentric, in truth, the way that we're supposed to do it, and I was kind of making an allusion to this last week, is something that we don't really like to do to begin with, which is to truly pray, right? We like to fill in our time doing a lot of other things just to make sure that we kind of feel like that void is filled. But the time that we spend in prayer is usually much less, right? If at all, even existent within the day. And so you might be a very active servant in doing all of these things in the church. And you'll come on Sunday and you'll learn all the hymns and you'll read the books and this sort of, but your prayer life itself is not something that's developed at all. Because, I'm not saying this about you, I'm saying this about all of us, right? In that we don't actually take the time to spend in prayer to know Christ, right? And so if we really want to do that, I mean, get the books and read the books and go and speak to the priest and listen to the sermons and this sort of thing, but then actually put that into practice, right? And the answer has been provided to us so many times over the years, but we're just not willing to really accept it because it's something that we're not very comfortable doing, right? I remember hearing someone give a sermon a few years ago, and he was saying that it's very hard for us in our Western culture to understand what meditation means. Because we'll sit down in quiet and we're very disturbed just by quiet, not even by prayer. Just sitting there quietly is very disturbing. And so some people might get into the car, and once they're driving, they have to turn on the radio. Something has to be on. Just in the background, even if they're not listening to the music or the talk or whatever, something has to be on just to distract me, because once you have to examine yourself, it becomes very uncomfortable. And yet this is what we're supposed to be doing, right? I mean, if you're really going to go and confess truly, you have to examine yourself truly before, right? This is what we're supposed to be doing, though it's very uncomfortable for us to do. And it becomes better as we practice through it. But in the beginning, it's going to feel really tough. It's going to feel like something that I'm not exactly sure how it's supposed to go. I'm supposed to go about doing it. And so what that prayer actually looks like for one person versus another is very different, right? One person might be go and say 10 Jesus prayers in a day, and the other person might be go and read the 12th hour Agbeya every night. You know what I mean? And it could range from reading the whole Agbeya to doing something very, very simple. The whole point of it, though, is that to whatever level that you are given or that you find yourself in, that you take that level and you try to develop it as much as possible so that we actually develop this prayer. That's how you will be Christ-centered, is by seeking Him out through prayer. That's how all of these fathers became Christ-centered, because they sought Him out in prayer. How does St. John Chrysostom know about all of this stuff? He knows it through prayer. He spent 6 years in a cell by himself before he went out to become a priest or a bishop or any of that, right? He just was praying. I'm not saying that you have to go and seclude yourself for an extended period of time so that you can do that. We just have to actually learn how to pray. And by and large, we're very poor at doing that. At least I speak for myself. Other questions? You guys really are asleep. Nothing else? Now's your time. All right.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What are, you just said that you feel like most of us are poor at doing it, but what is a good way to, like, pointers for prayer when you are very, like, constantly distracted, your life is busy, it's hard to, like, you know, you feel like the monks get these, like, revelations because they have all day to, like, focus and think, but, you know.
Many of them don't get those revelations. So when we speak about the monk's life, it's very easy for us to speak about what happened when they were 70 years old and they've been struggling with this for 50 years, because then we, like, highly glorify them and look at the great things and the great gifts that they got. But they spent 50 years of probably not having very many things beyond what we actually receive to be able to encourage them along the way, right? And so how are we supposed to do this? Sometimes it has to be by force. So if you feel like it's just going to be like when you feel like praying, then you're going to pray, it's not going to work out so well, right? And so I believe this is from Beginning to Pray by Metropolitan Anthony Bloom. I don't know if you guys have read this. I see some people laughing right now, so I assume that they have. He says that if you can imagine that there's a lumberjack that works all day outside, and all he's doing is going out and breaking wood all day long. And then he comes in, and he sits down on the couch, and he's sweaty, and he's tired, and this sort of thing. And his wife comes up to him, as wives do, and she says, "Honey, do you love me?" When he's sweating and he's just coming in from outside, right? And she says, "Of course I love you." And then she says, "Do you feel it right now? Do you feel like you love me right now?" He says, "No, I feel tired and sweaty and I want to go take a shower and this, but I know that I love you," right? And so there are times when there's going to be this great zeal where we feel this love for God, and then there are these other times when we're not going to feel it, and we're going to rely on the fact that we know that we have felt it before in the past, for example, something like that, right? And so at times, especially in the beginning, because we're very unpracticed in this, it's not like grace is going to come and superabound in you right from the beginning. And then you're going to have this great revelation. You're going to say, "I'm going to document this and journal it so that for the next 50 years, I'm going to remember what happened on January the 26th, right? I know that this is going to hold me over." It's not necessarily going to happen like that. But in the beginning, sometimes it has to be by force. But it's directed force. It's force with a purpose, right? Like many people think that going to church is doing something by force, and sometimes it is, right? But standing there, if all you're doing is standing there, for example, when people go to Tazbihah, if all they're doing is standing there for 2 hours or 2.5 hours or something like that, and they say, "Well, I have to get through Tazbihah because this is going to be really important. I'm forcing myself along this way." Or if you're reading the Agbeya and your father of confession recommends that you read the Agbeya, for example, something like that. If all you're doing is getting it and opening it up and just reading words and not trying to process anything that's happening, it's not going to be of much benefit to you, right? And that's by and large what many of us end up doing. So we know that we have to go to liturgy on a weekly basis, but when we go, we're just kind of standing there. Okay, I'm here on time. All right, I guess it has to work. This is me doing it by force because I woke up early. And so there's some benefit to waking up early and this sort of thing. But the true benefit comes from doing this stuff by force, knowing that there's going to be an outcome for it that's going to be positive. It's just like when we study in school, right? When you sit down and finals are approaching and you've been a terrible procrastinator and you know that you have to sit down and go through, 20 lectures in some very short period of time, usually the night before, and you have to go through all of this stuff, you know that you're going to have a miserable time doing that, right? And yet you know that you're doing it for a purpose, right? And so you're focusing that entire time because you want to receive a purpose from it. You want to get the goal that comes out from that. And so it's not going to be an immediate payout like the procrastination up to the night before and then just going in the next day and putting everything down on paper. But it's going to be something like this for many of us because we have to struggle through that because we find ourselves so unpracticed in actually sitting down and speaking to God.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Just wanted to read a quote real quick.
Yeah.
If I didn't close it. It's really short. But to answer kind of what you were talking about, what he was asking why you're born, but it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than the fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. So it raises the idea we don't know the greater plan, so that is the only reason that we don't know why he created us. But from his vast knowledge, he knows that this was better for us.
By and large, many of us are not aware of why he created us. The fathers experienced why he created us and told us why he actually created us, right? And so, for us to be here, the goal is to be one with God. And he speaks about this. I think it's in John 17, when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he prays that we are one with him as he is with the Father, right? That we may be one with him. This is our purpose. This is our goal. Now, practically speaking, many of us can't really relate to this because we don't know that part, right? We don't know practically what that actually looks like for us because we haven't done it yet, right? And so you press on towards the goal. That's what you're supposed to continue to do. To press on knowing that even though you haven't experienced it yet, this is supposed to be what you're supposed to experience, right? And so the ultimate goal I'm going to drop this and then we'll probably finish up here without clarifying. The ultimate goal is theosis, right? I mean, that's what we're really supposed to be after here, is theosis. That's what we're here for. That's what we're intended to do. We're intended to be one with God. That's what we're intended to do. Not by nature, but by grace, by adoption. That's what we're supposed to do, so that we can actually experience this love. Love is creative, and so love created so that it could have its creation share in its love. That's why we're here. Anyone else? All good?
Just for the
Yeah.
folks who weren't around to understand what theosis means,
Yeah.
could you just give us like a one paragraph tying it back to the whole growing in the likeness thing that you talked about?
There's never one paragraph with theosis. Theosis, as most succinctly stated, was first, I believe, stated by St. Irenaeus, and then stated repeatedly by many other fathers, St. Athanasius and this sort of thing, and so we usually quote St. Athanasius for saying this, when he says God became man so that man might become God, right? So that we can actually share in that trait with him. Again, not so that we can be God, like be the creative one, and be the one that's all-knowing and all-powerful and all-present. Not God like that, but God in sharing with him in the work that he allows us to share in. Ultimately, that's what theosis is. Ultimately. To see God as he is and to share in his work with him. And to share in that love and to be one with him. Now there's plenty of holes in that because you can't sum it up in one paragraph. And so I just want to put that out there. You guys should have like a whole series on theosis. If you're so inclined. Any other questions?
Do you want to come back and do a theory?
I think you guys are probably done with me. That's okay. There are pray. It'll come to you. All right, guys. Let's stand up to pray.
In the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Lord, thank you so much. Thank you for blessing us with these words of wisdom, with this lesson. I pray now that we have learned that we go and put it into action. That we learn to pray real prayer. That it's not superficial, that it's not just us reading words on a page, or us just standing and muttering in vain repetition, Lord, but that it's us developing a personal relationship with you, that it's us beginning to know you the way the saints knew you, and that in beginning to know you that we can become like you, that we can grow in your likeness, that we can grow towards that perfection and the ability to love in the works that you intend for us, in the purpose that you intend for us on this earth and then in eternity, Lord, that you guide us in that purpose, that as we struggle and fall every day, that you help us to get up again and strive towards you, that through this difficult, straining, struggling, painful process where we try to renounce all of the things that are holding us back, Lord, that it's you performing the surgery on us and not us trying to perform the surgery on ourselves. that it's you healing the disease of sin within us, Lord. Please, Lord, come and heal us. Come and save us, Lord. Through the intercession of Saint Mary and Saint Mark and all the saints who have pleased you from the beginning, hear us as we pray thankfully, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil one. Through Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever.